Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm very excited to be here. I just moved to California from New York City, where I was living for the last 17 years. And yeah, it's really different. But and it's funny because I moved the end of last August. So, for the beginning part, and I moved to Santa Cruz. And for the beginning part, I was like, oh, it's not that different than Manhattan. It's not that different than Manhattan. And only recently, I'm like, everyone walks really slowly here. It's so funny. It's finally settling in. But anyway, so I'm very, very excited. I was on a book tour all last year to 55 cities. And then I took a break from the tour to get my grounding at VegNews. And so even though this is like the 56th time or something that I've talked about my book, it feels like the first because a lot has changed in the world and in my life in the last 8 months or so. My book, Always Too Much and Never Enough, came out last year, and it's really a journey toward personal authenticity, which for me is something that does change constantly because, as I just mentioned, the world is changing. Hopefully we're lifelong learners, and hopefully we're lifelong activists. So this story really focuses on how I learned the ways that I was being betrayed by the food industry, and in particular factory farming. And as I started to pick that apart, I realized all the ways I had actually been betraying myself. And that's what I talk about in this, how those two things kind of were a journey, one and the same. And, I'll talk about this a little bit later, in further detail, but one thing that I find fascinating as a very long time animal activist is that the power of personal narrative is something that is very underused by animal advocates. And it's something that I think is central to creating social change. So as I'm telling my story, I would love it if you started to think for yourself about what your story is, and don't brush it aside. Because we each have a story to tell about how we became awakened to something about ourselves and questioned assumptions about ourselves or about the world. And oftentimes, that's exactly what it takes for someone to hear in their own head, in their own heart, the reflection of their story and how they can question assumptions a little bit further. So another fascinating thing about Always Too Much and Never Enough is the title. I always thought the concept of being always too much and never enough was something that was just mine. And it wasn't until the book came out and I was traveling around and people were saying, this is my story, that I realized this is universal. For each of us here, whether the concept of being always too much and never enough is something that resonates with you regarding food, or regarding that relationship you just got out of, or regarding insert the blank toxic substance, always too much and never enough is something that so many of us are trying to find the balance with. For me, this is a story that's largely centered around food. I grew up in the fluorescent 1980s where I don't even think we owned dishes because we used to just eat those like cardboard diet microwavable meals, like Weight Watchers specifically. Do you remember those little squares? They were like the size of the palm of your hand, and you would put it in the microwave for 3.5 minutes, and the lasagna, no matter what, was still frozen in the middle, the last bite. Yeah, I know you feel my pain. I didn't eat vegetables until I was 30, except for the occasional buttered peas. That was my vegetable of choice. Anyway, I grew up as a chubby kid trying to stuff myself into my skinny mother's shadow, and I didn't have much luck. So when I think about the idea of always too much and never enough, it's not just food. It's not just the fact that at the end of the day of coming home from school after a day of really being bullied by the kids around me who were cruel, I had my best friend there, Oreos, and they were always there, no matter what. Of course, they're they're vegan, but that's another story. But that's actually a story that I do talk about in this, because it's not only a story about finding my way to vegetarianism and then veganism, but also finding my way to personal health and how that informed my activism more than anything else I had done. At the end of the day, I had really left out of the equation that I myself was an animal, and I myself was not respecting my own animal rights. So I'm going to start with a reading from when I was 17. New Jersey. Yeah, Jersey. Who's from Jersey? Where?
Flemington, and I went to Rutgers.
Oh, yeah, okay. Oh, really? All right. What? Okay, I'm from Edison. I left in the second I could, but I digress. Food, especially fast food, had not faded in its ability to comfort me as I stumbled through adolescence. If anything, I loved it more and more each year that passed. Double cheeseburgers were now the name of the game, providing me with the steadiness and solace that I coveted. They were always there, always the same. Of course, there was a darker side to this relationship. Perhaps not surprisingly, the more of them I ate, the more of them I craved. They satisfied me until they didn't. They assuaged my angst until the absence of them added to that angst. Such is the definition of an addictive relationship. Not that I saw it that way then, but I wasn't stupid, and I knew that I was somehow in the middle of a vicious cycle of eating crappy food and then feeling crappy about my body. Still, my love was too strong to resist. By the time I got a car, an enchanting 1986 Toyota Camry that I called Henry, which only accelerated, barely, if you stepped full force on the gas, there was no longer an obstacle between me and eating a second or sometimes third dinner. The fact that I was petrified of driving on highways was not a problem. Just down the road was a strip mall with everything I could ever need. A grocery store, a Chinese place, a pizza joint, a brand new shiny Taco Bell, and of course my first and still greatest love, Burger King. A tub of chocolate icing from Food Town was the perfect appetizer to a dinner of 2 cheeseburgers, extra large fries, and a vanilla milkshake. The blessed drive-thru was like the icing on the cake, or the pie, as it were, since the apple pie at Burger King was always an option to go with the shake. I would sit in the hidden part of the parking lot and blast my Patti LuPone cassette tape, eating my dinner at record speed. It was how I imagined heaven. I scoffed to myself when I thought of those kids who, like me, wanted a buzz, but wasted their money and their brain cells on drugs when they could have this much better, cheaper, legal, and more functional high. Who needed marijuana when you could have the perfect orgasmic combination of fatty, sweet, and salty that made French fries with ketchup so succulent? While my teenage journals were full of incredibly tormented poetry that made Sylvia Plath sound like Dr. Seuss, what I really should have been doing was writing love sonnets to my cheeseburger. Nestled behind the protective shield of Henry, whom I perhaps anthropomorphized a bit too readily, I finally felt genuine. I took a bite of my burger and I was myself. There was no other place in my life, not even in theater, not since the incident with the heckling, where I was safer, where I was calmer. I sipped my shake, and in my head, I had already escaped to New York City, where I knew I would live one day, though I wasn't entirely sure whether I wanted to be there so that I could achieve anonymity or fame. As I took a break from my burger and dug deeper into my tub of icing, my hopes and fears arm wrestled in my head, both certain they were destined to win. I will be incredibly famous. I will be amazingly fat. I will star on Broadway. I will be ugly. I will be rich. I will be a failure. I will be legendary. I will be forgotten. I will be loved. I will be loathed. I found that the faster I ate, the more rapidly my desires pushed my fears away, and the faster the image of Margaret and my other bullying classmates faded. So I picked up the pace and sprinted to the finish, licking my fingers to make sure no morsel would go undigested. I ate until I didn't remember that I was a reject. or at least until I didn't care. My stomach and heart swelled with satisfaction, and I felt full of life. The irony, of course, is that it was death I was full of, but I didn't see it that way for years. At the time, I was simply awaiting the cosmic high I received from the buttery bun, the smoky patty, the smooth shake that tingled as it slid down my throat into my soul and grounded me at my foundation. So, the way the book came to be was that I wrote an article for my Huffington Post column that got declined, and they didn't publish it. And it was a few years ago now, hard to believe, but it was about how after I ultimately lost nearly 100 pounds, the world started treating me very differently. And I was sort of expecting that maybe it would happen a little bit, but it happened to such a massive extent that it made me question everything. It was like I had jumped the fence from something that the world had previously disregarded into something that the world was celebrating now, or at least accepting. And as an animal rights activist who came to animal rights activism by the LGBTQ movement, this was fascinating to me, and it pissed me off. So my next reading speaks to that theme about how this personal experience, it really informed a lot of my activism. It really informed a lot of my body positivity activism. It really informed a lot of my animal rights activism, because really, at the end of the day, we're all individual bodies. The man next to me in the lobby of my building smiled at me. I secretly held my breath, convinced I was about to get mugged. He lingered as I grabbed the eclectic mix of lamp catalogs, tax documents, and Chinese restaurant menus from inside my tin box. It took me a minute to recognize him as my downstairs neighbor, a harmless-looking guy who had never said 3 words to me in the 5 years since I'd moved in. I used to try to strike up a conversation with him and with the other people who lived there, but to no avail, so I gave up trying, saving my energy for more important things like chewing. Admittedly, it had seemed odd to me to not offer the common universal courtesy of hi, or at least a head nod. After all, my neighbors and I knew extremely intimate details of each other's lives. I could smell what they were cooking for dinner. I could hear when they were arguing on the phone. I could easily catch glimpses of them in the hallway unloading their groceries from their granny carts or unloading their problems onto their partners, and I'm sure they knew the same things about me. So why they never said hello when we passed in the hallways always baffled me. And why I eventually took their lead and ignored them right back perhaps baffled me even more. But I got over it, figuring it was a New York City thing. Folks here were too cool for hellos, too busy for small talk. You came here to be famous, not affable. My neighbor was still standing there. I shut and locked my mailbox and then faced him, smiled just a tiny bit, lifted my eyebrows. I was grounded, but I was guarded, but I was present. If you want to talk, talk. You look great, he started, shaking his head left to right, a tad maniacally. I mean, I hope it's okay for me to say that, but gosh, do I even know your name? I'm Christian. I let a second go by, realizing what was happening here. I'm Jasmin, I responded, still somewhat guarded, perhaps more so actually. And thank you, I added, that's very nice. It's astonishing, I mean, wow. Christian was the one looking down now, acting somewhat embarrassed, one hand in his jeans pocket, the other one cupping the back of his neck. He was still shaking his head. How much weight did you lose, can I ask? I laughed nervously. My laugh was far away. I rubbed my thumb on the lamp catalog, wondering if they had any lampshades that weren't made of silk. Thank you, I said again, ignoring his question. That's really nice of you. And on some level, it was. After that day, when he would see me, Christian would go out of his way to hold the front door when I was carrying too many bags, to comment on the weather when we were again at the mailbox, and even every now and then to remind me that I looked great. My name is Thin, and I am the queen of this prom called life. That article pissed people off, by the way. People don't like to be questioned on what they believe is their behavior. I didn't. I still don't. But I also need it. We all need to be questioned by our safe spaces, our peers, our friends, and at the end of the day, ourselves. I had this interesting thing happen. My grandmother, who the book is dedicated to her, she really was my core, parent in a lot of ways. And at the end of her life, she lost the ability to use her limbs. And so she had to be in a wheelchair. And so she was actually jumping on that socially acceptable spectrum too, but in the opposite direction. And my grandmother was the first person I knew who had an identity that was unwaveringly authentic. And she was the first person I knew who didn't really care when people who had previously adored her began to dismiss her and didn't really have time anymore for a little old lady in a wheelchair. When I would push the chair and she would, people would talk to me instead of to her. Have you had that experience with yourself or with people in your life? It's like you no longer see people with disabilities. My grandmother would look at them in the eye and answer for herself. And that's because at the end of the day, my grandmother answered to herself. And for my grandmother, who went vegan at 86, nobody was going to define her for her. And that has always stuck with me, even in the darkest moments. I was given a piece of advice that I talked about just a moment ago. I was given a piece of advice by my agent when I was writing the book proposal, which is a hellish process that I wish on nobody. And I'm actually writing another book proposal right now, so feed me whiskey. Anyway, he told me anytime you feel as though you're proselytizing, just take a step off of your soapbox and talk about how the story was to you and how you experienced it. I've been an activist for a long time. I knew that. But something about being told that very specifically and explicitly at that moment in time, it changed me. So rather than talk about how when I was 24 years old, I went to see a screening of a documentary about factory farming. I was already vegetarian. And I sat in the room and I saw in front of me these babies being torn away from their parents. Rather than talk about the fact that what is going on factory farms for animals, I talked about how that experience resonated with me as someone who grew up with a broken home. And I talked about my leg, which would not stop shaking, and I don't generally have shaky legs, and I was baffled by that. I saw on the screen in front of me dairy and eggs and the production of them, and I saw dairy cows and egg-laying hens basically being an industry that was banking on the exploitation of the female reproductive parts, and I thought of how I had been also exploited for my female body parts at certain points in my life. And that really struck me as a feminist and as somebody who cared about women's liberation, about equality for all genders. And it struck me as something I could no longer support. So that's what I did. Instead of just talking about the issues in my book as though it was a brochure, and there's room and roles for brochures, I talked about what it meant to me. And that worked because I was lucky enough that when the book came out, I didn't get any bad reviews. And that's because what asshole journalist is going to take the story of some bullied kid who talks about their, experiences and put down their story of going vegan? So, win-win, right? Think about your stories. I hope you're thinking about them, like I said at the beginning of this. Here's the section where I was 19 and I went vegetarian. I was a theater student in Philadelphia at the time. And it's just a small example of how I use personal narrative to develop what I hope is a mainstream audience for my book that's actually about being vegan. Looking back on it, though I didn't realize it at the time, the day I ate my last cheesesteak was the first time I gave any thought to where food actually came from. Coming right up, Jazz, chirped the mustached man who made the cheesesteaks on my route to school. Though I saw this guy more consistently than I saw many other people in my life, and he actually cared enough to ask me my name, I never thought to ask him his in return. Our relationship was based solely on a sandwich. Thanks, I said, then proceeded to comment on the sunny weather, feeling as though if I didn't say something, the only thing either of us would have focused on was the embarrassing regularity with which I consumed cheesesteaks. This was my second, just this afternoon. Walking away a few minutes later, I held in my hands my $3 home-cooked meal. Why hadn't I known that food could taste like this? It wasn't even frozen in the middle. Frequently, with my cheesesteak in hand, I would walk back to my apartment and consume it in privacy, or at the very least, I would traipse over to Rittenhouse Square Park and eat it while sitting on a bench. But on days like today, when my appetite was ravenous and my energy frenetic, I would simply eat and walk, weaving in and out of foot traffic as effortlessly as I avoided the searing reality that each one of my sandwiches held inside the bun an individual. Several individuals, more likely. Like most people, I pushed that thought out of my head entirely, choosing to ignore the painful truth behind the meat I ate. But on this day, for some reason, reality intruded. I thought of Emily and her quiet boycott. I didn't even know the driving force behind her vegetarianism, whether it was based on health concerns or animal welfare or environmentalism. But something about her decision to forego flesh spoke to me in a way that suddenly I could not ignore. With my sandwich in my hand and these thoughts occupying my brain space, I furiously walked across Broad Street, nearly tripping over my feet more than once. I suddenly realized I was right in front of my school's main building, and the cascade of stone stairs leading up to the entrance called to my tired body, so I parked myself and my meal there. I had only taken a few bites out of my cheesesteak by then, and I was still holding it, tightly grasped in my hand like a piece of evidence that shocked the jury. Was I on the witness stand? Yes, Your Honor, I watched as this individual's flesh was chopped up and cooked by a person who then served it to me with a soda. An unfamiliar feeling washed over me like a wave, giving me a vague sense of car sickness. I stared at my sandwich, but resisted the urge to go in for the kill, that is, to take another bite. Suddenly, I realized what I was feeling, and the magnitude of it made me shudder. It was completely foreign to me, yet as soon as I realized what it was, there was no doubt. It was the feeling of losing my appetite. So, as I mentioned, I didn't eat a vegetable until I was 30. And that's because I was too busy eating processed junk food, which what I didn't realize as a kid who would come home and Oreos were always there in the little bread box in between the front door and the kitchen. I could still feel what the knob felt like on that bread box. Do you have those memories from childhood? Yeah. I could still feel that. I could still know the sound of opening that Oreos container and seeing if my mom was around because I didn't want her to see me doing it. That was actually part of a system. I was unwillingly and unknowingly a piece of this much bigger problem. I was part of a system that was reliant on my willful ignorance to continue to consume more and more and more, because what I didn't realize then was that these foods were actually being created with the exact right ratio of fat to salt to smushiness to go down my gullet at exactly the right speed and hit that part of my brain that would constantly want more, more, more. Of course, it was always too much and never enough. It was always too much food, but never enough. I wanted more, more, more. And emotionally speaking, I was also addicted. So it wasn't just the food, it was also myself. I felt like I was too much, taking up too much space in the room, but never enough. Never able to live up to what my mother thought I should be, or what I thought society wanted me to be, or what I really ultimately wanted to be myself. I didn't understand that, because how could I when I was too busy stuffing myself with Oreos and Cheez-Its and you name it. So when I went vegetarian at 19, I see in retrospect, it was really the first time that I was allowing that little truth inside of me to come out. A lot of people who go vegetarian or vegan do so for the first time in college. And that's because that's the first time that we have food available to us and we are making those choices for ourselves. How many of you stopped or changed your eating habits around that age, 18 to 22? Like most people in this room, it's why a lot of advocacy organizations focus their grassroots efforts on college campuses, at least somewhat. Anyway, when I was 24, I went vegan, and I immediately started working for an animal rights organization, and I immediately thrust myself into this. And so I would work really long and hard days, constantly, just unendingly. And at the end of the day, I saw New York City as this elaborate web that connected the amazing, not-to-be-missed pizza on the Upper West Side to that vegan cupcake in Williamsburg. I know exactly how to tell you to get there and exactly what stop to get off of the L train to get there. And the West Village had this vegan panini that was to die for, and I saw it as my moral obligation to try all of them because, after all, it was for the animals. And let's pause for a minute and kind of talk about the good part of that problem, which is that there is literally a vegan version of every single animal product out there. Yes. And that was fantastic, and that opened my eyes. But what I wasn't doing was eating vegetables. What I wasn't doing was practicing radical self-care, or any kind of self-care for that matter. I just sat in front of my desk and I worked. Work was always too much and never enough. It was how I related to everything: food, people, and my work. Does this sound like anybody else's story? Yeah. It's very much an issue that we have going on universally in a lot of different circles. And so I was putting myself aside and aside and aside. And when I was 30, I couldn't go up a flight of stairs without stopping to check a pretend text message to catch my breath. And someone handed me a copy, a press copy, an advance copy of the documentary Fat, Sick, and Nearly Dead. Have you seen it? It stars Joe Cross, and he is a businessman in Australia who juice fasted his way back to health and documented the whole thing. And I had previously been told about this, but it was this like kind of the perfect storm. I had just gone to the doctor, and the doctor told me at age 30, as a longtime vegan, that I was on my way to heart disease. What? I knew about health. I have a master's degree in health. And yet I was falling apart. And then that was conflicting with my view of myself and of body positivity, and I didn't want to just ascribe to what other people thought I should look like. By the way, I don't. Anyway, so I decided for the first time to approach my self-care and my radical self-care and my health as an extension of my activism, understanding that I could not possibly take care of anyone else without taking care of myself first. And if you're a parent, if you're in the service giving industry, if you are a teacher, then this is true for you as well. I mean, for any of us, really. I was completely neglecting myself. So I no longer looked at what I was about to embark on as a means of losing weight. It was no longer about my skinny mother and the fact that I would never look like her. It was no longer about finding the perfect body. It was about health and longevity, not only for the animals, but for myself as well. So I went on a juice fast with my then partner, and we went on a juice fast every month for 3 years. 10 days one month, 3 days the next, then 10, then 3, then 10, then 3, and I lost nearly 100 pounds like that. And in between, I started eating a diet that consisted mainly of whole foods. I followed Eat to Live, Dr. Furman, but really it's kind of the same thing. I know that there's someone in here who hates me right now because I'm comparing T. Colin Campbell's work to Dr. Furman's work to Rip Esselstyn's work, and oh my God, they allow a potato, and oh my God, they allow 1 teaspoon of oil. I don't care. It's about eating whole foods and eating vegetables. But the final reading I have for you today is an extension of all that. It has to do with the relationship with my body that changed remarkably throughout the years. And that also started when at the same time as I went vegetarian, around that same time. On my 18th birthday, I was living in Philadelphia. I was a theater student, and I took myself out on my 18th birthday for a Slurpee, party kid that I was. And I was standing there in front of the 7-Eleven, slurping my Slurpee, and across the street there was like a pop-up tent for a psychic. She saw me. I saw her. It said, "Tilly, psychic readings, $20. And I was like, and I came over, and what I later realized was that she was like a graduate of my theater program and was down and out, preying on young theater students like myself. And I sat there, and she proceeded to give me a psychic reading that changed my life. It was like she saw me. It was like she knew me. And it was my first day as an adult, and I found everything by sitting there with Tilly. And before I left, I made myself a promise that 2 weeks later, my very best friend at college, Hazel, it was her 18th birthday, and I took her as her gift to see Tilly, and I was so excited. I sat next to Hazel, and I listened as Tilly proceeded to give Hazel the exact same reading as she had given me. Verbatim. Tilly was a fake. But before I realized that Tilly was a fake, she had given me a piece of advice that had seeped in, and that was to be bold. And so when I left my appointment with Tilly that evening, I made my very first decision as an adult, my first bold one, and I got a tattoo. I decided on a nickel-sized black star on my right shoulder blade. Why a star? Asked the burly, unshaven 40-year-old tattoo artist wearing a ratty Nirvana t-shirt. My meeting with Tilly was making me feel a new sense of courage, and so I boldly said, because I'm going to be one. I closed my eyes just after those words escaped my mouth because I was sure that the tattoo artist was going to laugh at my proclamation just a smidge, just enough to make sure that I wouldn't notice, except I would have. So I closed my eyes instead and disappeared into my world of aspiring stardom and newfound adulthood. Let him laugh. Eventually, I was sure the joke would be on him and on everyone else who had ever decided I was less than because I was fat or foolish. Getting a tattoo wasn't something I'd ever seriously considered before that night because I was sure that it would have conflicted with my acting career. But a small black tattoo was, I figured, easily coverable. In high school, one of my classmates had a tattoo, and I remember being horrified by it. I went home and said to my mother, how could she just make a decision like that, which will last the rest of her life? But I fixated on her tattoo unendingly, shocked by its permanence, intrigued by its confidence. When I was growing up in Edison, New Jersey, the only thing I considered permanent was my desire to get the hell out. As soon as the needle hit my skin and I felt a sensation that was very much reminiscent of a cat scratch, I knew there was no turning back. It's like that moment you go in for a kiss with your beloved and attractive friend crossing that line for good. There are no backseas allowed. Same with the tattoo. Much like my tattooed high school comrade, the permanence of the ink would forever memorialize this moment in my life, and it would grow and evolve as I did. You're done, said the Nirvana guy. That's it? I asked, deciding then and there that I would be different now. That's it, he responded, handing me a mirror and holding up another one so that I could see the tattoo. There it was. A tiny black spot of proof that I belonged to myself. Wow, was all I could muster. A moment later, the tattooist looked me in the eyes for the first time, and I noticed with a tenderness that surprised me that his were a deep royal blue. He smiled at me in a way you'd imagine a father would smile at his child on the first day of kindergarten or the last day of high school, and he said, I hope you do become a star. Maybe the world wasn't quite as mean as I had always assumed. Thanks, I offered, then let a beat go by. Before I left, I quickly added, my tattoo is fabulous, but I think it's my last one. If I'm going to be an actress, I can't exactly be full of tattoos. The Nirvana guy half smiled. Oh, you'll be back, he said. I rolled my eyes at him, or with him. Somehow I knew he was right. He was right. And the reason I brought that up was because it was like I was reclaiming my body. It was like I was doing that from the moment that I got that tattoo. And I'm not saying that you all need to like leave and get a tattoo on your way home, but it's Berkeley. I'm sure we could get a group discount or something. Like we could call like, hi, me and 50 of my closest friends are coming. Yeah, like I don't know, what do you think, like a kale leaf or something? Who's in? I'm in. It was like I needed to manifest on my body the fact that it was mine. And, you know, we don't need to do it tangibly like I did, though again, I recommend it. But, you know, to each their own, and that's the thing, to each their own. All of this informed my animal rights activism. All of the ways that the world changed its view of me. The fact that I became healthy, it informed my view of animal activism because I no longer thought that I could be a martyr. There's something actually, I don't have this totally, I was just starting to think about this in the last day, that there's something like really privileged about being a martyr. Like we are animals as well, and by being a martyr, it's like we're stepping outside of that and being part of this hierarchical system that so many of us stand against. So we need to take care of ourselves if we're going to be taking care of those around us, and it begins with looking in the mirror every single day and every single day making the conscious choice to no longer ascribe to a belief system that someone somewhere along the way decided we should hold as our truth. I don't have an end to this story. I don't want to tell you the end because I want you to buy the book. But I also don't want to because there is no end. This is a moment in time. It happens to be memorialized, but really it's just a moment in time that's constantly evolving. Just like your stories are constantly evolving, which I hope you tell. I hope you tell them in art, and I hope you tell them in safe spaces, because that's another thing we need as part of taking care of ourselves in today's climate. And climate is a perfect way of ending today because it is our vegan Earth Day here, and this is another way of looking at all of this from a holistic perspective. Because of course being vegan is the very best thing we could do for the planet. It's the very best thing we could do for living in accordance with our own ethical beliefs, and part of that needs to be compassion for ourselves as well. So I will take questions in just a minute. I think I have like maybe, 7 minutes. Whoa, that was good, huh? 7 minutes? See, if you eat your kale, you start to know what time it is without looking at your watch. Amazing. Imagine what that kale tattoo will do for us as a unit. I hope that I will be selling books right outside as soon as I'm done with this. There's also an audiobook. I do narrate it if you're more into audiobooks. I don't have that with me. You'll have to download that. I can't sign it either. But if you like the book, I hope that you'll leave a friendly review on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or wherever you want to. If you don't like the book, don't say anything. I just want to briefly tell you that, yes, I'm the senior editor for VegNews Magazine. Perhaps you're familiar. I am also the love columnist for VegNews, which is funny. And I am the co-host and co-founder of Our Hen House, which if you don't listen to it yet, you have like 383 episodes to catch up on. So there will be a quiz next Friday. Clear your schedules. We have a lot of fun, my co-host Marianne Sullivan and I, and we cover everything from current events from the world of animal rights to interviews with movers and shakers from all walks of life, and it's available wherever podcasts are. We believe in being indefatigably positive, and we do it partly as a strategy, because let me tell you, I don't wake up that way. But I think hope can be mustered. And sometimes that is something that we need to believe on a political level, and sometimes that's something we need to hold on to on a personal level. I'm actually having a pretty sad day today, and I decided to be hopeful, because what else do we have? We have the ability to shift our mindset, I'll tell you that. And when you see the animals all around us being exploited, and people all around us being exploited and commodified and abused and tortured, what do we have? Do we want to be hopeless? Or do we want to eat our vegetables and have hope? So that's what I'll leave you with, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you. Hi.
Wow. I relate to you so much, being vegan from Jersey, tattooed, releasing a child, beaten up like crazy, dropped a bunch of weight after I went vegan, and then had my family be all like, oh, you look so good, don't lose any more weight.
Right.
You know, you're too skinny.
Yeah.
Why won't you eat the brisket? You know, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think it's such an important message for, young developing vegans to hear as well. But what really struck me was what you said about your grandmother, actually. I was also very close to my grandmother and partially raised by her, but when I went vegetarian and I couldn't eat her chicken soup anymore, she took it like as an insult.
Yeah.
Like, but this is like, we used to make this together when you were a kid, and da-da-da-da-da. The
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I'm so excited about your accent. Well, okay, I have a couple different answers. One is as an activist, and one is just as a person. Well, you know what I mean. From an activist perspective, how do you reach people who don't want to be reached? You don't. You move on to the next person. You could probably, influence 10 people in that 15 minutes who you couldn't have influenced. And it's hard because it's emotional, because it's your parents and it's your grandparents and it's the people who you're closest to. But there comes a point where you gotta leave the conversation and you actually have no idea how much influence you're making on that person. So my grandmother, for example, and she wrote an essay about this for Our Hen House because we used to have a online magazine as well. And so it's called Never Too Late to Change the World. She knew about, we were all vegan for a very long time before she went vegan. And it was one thing. And so I would say that you should always, I actually want to take back what I just said a second ago about my answers as an activist or as a person. You should always speak your truth, no matter what, and be unapologetic about it. And be strategic about where you're putting your energy. So if you're putting too much energy into someone who won't change, then go have a hot tub with someone and talk about it, and then do some other advocacy. And understand that your grandmother, or whomever, might be excited about your truth because they love you and they want to support you. And maybe they have another inroad. Like maybe they're also concerned about their health, so let's show them forks over knives. And you know how to do this. And maybe they're concerned about, maybe they're like a philosophy student, and so you want to give them a copy of Animal Liberation by Peter Singer, who is no relation to me, by the way, but I like to call him Dad. He doesn't appreciate it. So I'd say be mindful of your energy. I think I have time for one more question, and then I'll be outside signing books. A quick one. Okay.
I may have misunderstood, but it sounded like to me that you made a connection between the way that people can be cruel to each other and the way that people can be cruel to animals. Mm-hmm. And I've never really thought about that, so I was wondering if you noticed any specifics.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I, again, have personal examples, but there's also examples that are statistically proven, about the danger of working in slaughterhouses, for example, the high rates of domestic violence, the amount that we just shut off when we're cruel to animals and cruel to other humans in our lives. So that would be an example in that realm. And on a personal level, yeah, for sure. I think that for me, as soon as I started to encompass animal rights into the rest of my worldview of social justice, I started to notice, I started to question assumptions left and right, but on the same, on the opposite side of the same coin, I started to realize the way I personally was treating others. That was shocking to me. That's something I talk about in my book, is that once people started to treat me the way that I wanted to be treated, I questioned their motives, and then I noticed how I was being a shit to other people. So I think once we incorporate compassion and ahimsa to everybody around us, including animals, it could shift our perspectives and impact the way we treat others. That got a little airy-fairy, but I live in Santa Cruz. Okay, thank you.